Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The New Science by Giambattista Vico. We are on Book 2, which is titled Poetic Wisdom, and we are reading the Prolegomena and introduction from that section. And we begin with paragraph 361. We have said above in the axioms that all the histories of the Gentile nations have had fabulous beginnings, that among the Greeks, who had given us all we know of Gentile antiquity, the first sages were the theological poets, and that the nature of everything born or made betrays the crudeness of its origin. It is thus and not otherwise that we must conceive the origins of poetic wisdom. And as for the great and sovereign esteem in which it has been handed down to us, this has its origin in the two conceits mentioned in the axioms, that of the nations on the one hand, and that of the scholars on the other. And it springs even more from the latter than from the former. For just as Manetho, the Egyptian high priest, translated all the fabulous history of Egypt into a sublime natural theology, as we have said in the axioms, so the Greek philosophers translated theirs into philosophy. And they did so not merely for the reason that, as we have seen above in the axioms, to both alike the histories that had come down to them were disgusting, but for the following 5 reasons as well. 362. The first was reverence for religion, for the Gentile nations were everywhere founded by fables on religion. The second was the grand effect thence derived of the civil world, so wisely ordered that it could only be the effect of a superhuman wisdom. The third was the occasions which, as we shall see, these fables, assisted by the veneration of religion and the credit of such great wisdom, gave the philosophers for instituting research and for meditating lofty things in philosophy. The fourth was the ease with which they were thus enabled, as we shall also show farther on, to explain their sublime philosophical meditations, by means of the expressions happily left them by the poets. The fifth and last, which is the sum of them all, is the confirmation of their own meditations, which the philosophers derived from the authority of religion and the wisdom of the poets. Of these 5 reasons, the first 2 and the last contain the praises of the divine wisdom, which ordained this world of nations, and the witness the philosophers bore to it even in their errors. The third and fourth are the deceptions permitted by divine providence, that thence there might arise philosophers to understand and recognize it for what it truly is, an attribute of the true God. 363. Throughout this book it will be shown that only so much as the poets had first sensed of vulgar wisdom did the philosophers later understand of esoteric wisdom, so that the former may be said to have been the sense and the latter the intellect of the human race. What Aristotle said of the individual man is therefore true of the race in general, that there is nothing in the intellect that has not first been in the senses. That is, the human mind does not understand anything of which it has had no previous impression, which our modern metaphysicians call occasion from the senses. Now the mind uses the intellect when, from something it senses, it gathers something which does not fall under the senses, and this is the proper meaning of the Latin verb intelligere. Chapter 1. Wisdom in General. 364. Now, before discussing poetic wisdom, it is necessary for us to see what wisdom in general is. Wisdom is the faculty which commands all the disciplines by which we acquire all the sciences and arts that make up humanity. Plato defines wisdom as the perfecter of man. Man, in his proper being as man, consists of mind and spirit, or if we prefer, of intellect and will. It is the function of wisdom to fulfill both these parts in man, the second by way of the first, to the end that by a mind illuminated by knowledge of the highest things, the spirit may be led to choose the best. The highest things in the universe are those turned toward and conversant with God. The best are those which look to the good of all mankind. The former are called divine things, the latter human. True wisdom, then, should teach the knowledge of divine things in order to conduct human things to the highest good. We believe that this was the foundation on which Marcus Terentius Varro, who earned the title Most Learned of the Romans, erected his great work on things divine and human, his Antiquitates, of which the injustice of time has unhappily bereft us. We shall treat of these things in the present book so far as the weakness of our education and the meagerness of our erudition permit. 365. Wisdom among the Gentiles began with the muse defined by Homer in the golden passage of the Odyssey as, quote, knowledge of good and evil, end quote, and later called divination. It was on the natural prohibition of this practice, as something naturally denied to man, that God founded the true religion of the Hebrews, from which our Christian religion arose, as set forth in one of the axioms. The muse must thus have been properly at first the science of divining by auspices, and this, as stated in the axioms, was the vulgar wisdom of all nations, of which we shall have more to say presently. It consisted in contemplating God under the attribute of his providence, whereby from divinare his essence came to be called divinity. We shall see presently that the theological poets, who certainly founded the humanity of Greece, were versed in this wisdom. And this explains why the Latins called the judicial astrologers professors of wisdom. Wisdom was later attributed to men renowned for useful counsels given to mankind, as in the case of the 7 sages of Greece. The attribution was afterwards extended to men who, for the good of the peoples and nations, wisely ordered and governed commonwealths. Still later, the word wisdom came to mean knowledge of natural divine things. That is, metaphysics, called for that reason divine science, which, seeking knowledge of man's mind and God, and recognizing God as the source of all truth, must recognize him as the regulator of all good. So that metaphysics must essentially work for the good of the human race, whose preservation depends on the universal belief in a provident divinity. It is perhaps for having demonstrated this providence that Plato deserved to be called divine, and that which denies to God this great attribute must be called stupidity rather than wisdom. Finally, among the Hebrews, and thence among us Christians, wisdom was called the science of eternal things revealed by God, a science which among the Tuscans considered as knowledge of the true good and true evil, perhaps owed to that fact that the first name they gave it, science and divinity. 366. We must therefore distinguish more truly than Varro did the 3 kinds of theology. First, poetic theology, that of the theological poets, which was the civil theology of all the Gentile nations. Second, natural theology, that of the metaphysicians. Third, our Christian theology, a mixture of civil and natural with the loftiest revealed theology, all 3 united in the contemplation of divine providence. Our third kind takes the place of Varro's poetic theology, which among the Gentiles was the same as civil theology, which he distinguished it from both civil and natural theology, because, sharing the vulgar common error that the fables contained high mysteries of sublime philosophy, he believed it to be a mixture of both. Divine providence has so conducted human affairs that, starting from the poetic theology, which regulated them by certain sensible signs believed to be divine counsels sent to men by the gods, and by means of the natural theology which demonstrates providence by eternal reasons which do not fall under the senses, the nations were disposed to receive revealed theology in virtue of a supernatural faith, superior not only to the senses, but to human reason itself. Chapter 2. Exposition and Division of Poetic Wisdom. 367. But because metaphysics is the sublime science which distributes their determinate subject matters to all the so-called subaltern sciences, and because the wisdom of the ancients was that of the theological poets, who without doubt were the first sages of the Gentile world, as we have established in the axioms. And because the origins of all things must by nature have been crude, for all these reasons we must trace the beginnings of poetic wisdom to a crude metaphysics. From this, as from a trunk, there branch out from one limb logic, morals, economics, and politics, all poetic, and from another physics, the mother of their cosmography, and hence of astronomy, which gives their certainty to its two daughters, chronology and geography, all likewise poetic. We shall show clearly and distinctly how the founders of Gentile humanity, by means of their natural theology, or metaphysics, imagined the gods, how by means of their logic they invented languages, by morals created heroes, by economics founded families, and by politics cities, by their physics established the beginnings of things as all divine, by the particular physics of man in a certain sense created themselves, by their cosmography fashioned for themselves a universe entirely of gods, by astronomy carried the planets and constellations from earth to heaven, by chronology gave a beginning to measured times, and how to geography the Greeks, for example, described the whole world within their own Greece. 368. Thus our science comes to be at once a history of the ideas, the customs, and the deeds of mankind. From these three we shall derive the principles of the history of human nature, which we shall show to be the principles of universal history, which principles it seems hitherto to have lacked. Chapter 3. The Universal Flood and the Giants. 369. The founders of Gentile humanity must have been men of the races of Ham, Japheth, and Shem, which gradually, one after the other, renounced that true religion of their common father Noah, which alone in the family state had been able to hold them in human society by the bonds of matrimony, and hence of the families themselves. As a result of this renunciation, they dissolved their marriages and broke up their families by promiscuous intercourse, and began roving wild through the great forest of the earth. The race of Ham wandered through southern Asia, Egypt, and the rest of Africa. That of Japheth through northern Asia and Scythia, and thence through Europe. And that of Shem through all Middle Asia toward the east. By fleeing from the wild beasts, with which the great forest must have been abounded, and by pursuing women, who in that state must have been wild, indocile, and shy, they became separated from each other in their search for food and water. Mothers abandoned their children, who in time must have come to grow up without ever hearing a human voice, much less learning any human custom, and thus descended to a state truly bestial and savage. Mothers, like beasts, must merely have nursed their babies, let them wallow naked in their own filth, and abandoned them for good as soon as they were weaned. And these children, who had to wallow in their own filth, whose nitrous salts richly fertilized the fields, and who had to exert themselves to penetrate the great forest, grown extremely dense from the flood, would flex and contract their muscles in these exertions, and thus absorb nitrous salts into their bodies in greater abundance. They would be quite without that fear of gods, fathers, and teachers, which chills and benumbs even the most exuberant in childhood. They must therefore have grown robust, vigorous, excessively big in brawn and bone, to the point of becoming giants. This upbringing of theirs was even more savage than that to which, as noted above in the axioms, Caesar and Tacitus ascribed the gigantic stature of the ancient Germans, from which was derived that of the Goths, whom Procopius mentions, and which was like that of the Patagonians, supposed to exist today near the Strait of Magellan. Philosophers and physics have spoken much nonsense on this subject, collected by Chassaignon, who wrote De Gigantibus. Of such giants there have been found, and are still being found, for the most part in the mountains, a circumstance with an important bearing on what we have to say below, great skulls and bones of an unnatural size, which is further exaggerated by vulgar tradition for reasons of which we shall speak in their proper place. 370. Such giants were scattered over the earth after the flood. We have seen them in the fabulous history of the Greeks, and the Latin philologians, without being aware of it, have told us of their existence in the ancient history of Italy, where they say that the most ancient peoples of Italy, the so-called aborigines, claim to be autochthones, which is as much as to say sons of earth, which among the Greeks and Latins meant nobles. And in the fables, the Greeks quite properly called the sons of earth giants, and the earth mother of giants. The Greek term autochthones should be rendered in Latin indigene, that is, properly those born of a land. Thus the native gods of a people or nation are called de indigetes, as if inde geniti, or as we should say more shortly today, ingeniti, for the syllable de is one of the redundancies of the first languages of the peoples, which we shall discuss later. Thus, among the Latins we find induperator for imperator, and in the Law of the 12 Tables, indiocito for iniocito, whence perhaps it came that armistices were called induciae, as if initiae, because they must have been called from icer fuedos, to make a pact of peace. So, in the case in hand, from indigene was derived ingenu, whose first and proper meaning was noble, whence the term artis ingenui, noble arts, but which finally came to mean free, though artis liberalis kept the meaning noble arts. For nobles alone, as will shortly be demonstrated, composed the first cities, in which the plebeians were slaves or precursors of slaves. 371. The same Latin philologians observed that all the ancient peoples were called aborigines, and sacred history tells us of those peoples called Emim and Zomzimim, which Hebrew scholars take to mean giants, one of whom was Nimrod. And the giants before the flood are described by Scripture as brave, famous, and powerful men of the age. The Hebrews, on account of their cleanly upbringing and their fear of God and of their fathers, continue to be of the proper stature in which God had created Adam and Noah, had begotten his 3 sons. And it was perhaps an abomination of gigantism that the Hebrews had so many ceremonial laws pertaining to bodily cleanliness. The Romans preserved a great vestige of these laws in the public sacrifice intended to purge the city of all sins of the citizens, which was performed with water and fire. Their solemn nuptials were also celebrated with water and fire, and participation in these 2 things was even the mark of citizenship, the deprivation of which was called interdictum aqua et igni. The sacrifice with fire and water was called lustrum, which came to mean a period of 5 years, because that was the interval between these sacrifices, much as among the Greeks an Olympiad meant a period of 4 years. But lustrum also meant a den of wild beasts, and the verb lustrare, to seek out, or to purge, must have first meant to seek out these dens, and purge them of the beast lurking within. Whence the water was required for the sacrifice was called the aqua lustralis. The Greeks began to count their years from the burning of the Nemean forest by Hercules to clear it for sowing grain, in commemoration of which, as we pointed out in the idea of the work, and as we shall see fully later, he founded the Olympiads. The Romans, with more discernment, began to count their years in lustra, from the water of the sacred ablutions, because civilization began with water, the need of which was felt before that of fire, as appears from the formulas of marriage and interdict, in which aqua comes before igni. This is the origin of the sacred ablutions, which must precede sacrifices, a custom which was and is common to all nations. It was by becoming imbued with this cleanliness of body and this fear of gods and of fathers, in both cases a fear we shall find amounting to terror in the earliest times, that the giants diminished to our normal stature. It was perhaps for this reason that from politia, which means in Greek civil government, was derived the Latin politus, clean or neat. 372. This diminution of stature must have continued down to the human period of the nations, as is demonstrated by the excessively large weapons of the ancient heroes, which Augustus, according to Suetonius, preserved along with the bones and skulls of the ancient giants in his museum. Thus, as stated in the axioms, the entire first world of men must be divided into two kinds. The first, men of normal size, which includes the Hebrews only. The second, giants, who were the founders of the Gentile nations. Of the giants there were in turn two kinds. The first, the sons of earth, or nobles, from whom, as being giants in the full sense of the term, the age of giants took its name, as we have said, and it is these whom sacred history defines as strong, famous, and powerful men of the age. The second, less properly so called, those other giants who were subjugated by the former. 373. The time at which the founders of the Gentile nations reached this condition of gigantism is fixed a century after the deluge for the race of Shem, and 2 centuries for those of Japheth and Ham, as postulated above. Below, presently, will be given the physical history of this matter, which, though related to us in the Greek fables, has not hitherto been observed, and which at the same time will give us a new physical history of the universal flood. We now proceed to Section 1, Poetic Metaphysics. Chapter 1, Poetic Metaphysics as the Origin of Poetry, Idolatry, Divination, and Sacrifices. 374. From these first men, stupid, insensate, and horrible beasts, all the philosophers and philologians should have begun their investigations of the wisdom of the ancient Gentiles. That is, from the giants in the proper sense in which we have just taken them. Father Bulduc, in his De Ecclesia Ente Legum, says the scriptural names of the giants signify pious, venerable, and illustrious men. But this can be understood only of the noble giants, who by divination founded the Gentile religions and gave the age of giants its name. And they should have begun with metaphysics, which seeks its proofs not in the external world, but within the modifications of the mind of him who meditates it. For, as we have said above, since this world of nations has certainly been made by men, it is within these modifications that its principles should have been sought. And human nature, so far as it is like that of animals, carries with it this property, that the senses are its sole way of knowing things. 375. Hence, poetic wisdom, the first wisdom of the Gentile world, must have begun with a metaphysic not rational and abstract like that of learned men now, but felt and imagined as that of the first men must have been, who without power of ratiocination were all robust sense and vigorous imagination, as established in the axioms. This metaphysic was their poetry, a faculty born with them, for they were furnished by nature with these senses and imaginations. Born of their ignorance of causes, for ignorance, the mother of wonder, made everything wonderful to men who were ignorant of everything, as noted in the axioms. Their poetry was at first divine, because they imagined the causes of the things they felt and wondered at to be gods, as we saw in the passage from Lactantius cited in the axioms. This is now confirmed by the American Indians, who call gods all things that surpass their small understanding. We may add the ancient Germans dwelling about the Arctic Ocean, of whom Tacitus tells that they spoke of hearing the sun pass at night from west to east through the sea, and affirmed that they saw the gods. These very rude and simple nations help us to a much better understanding of the founders of the Gentile world with whom we are now concerned. At the same time, they gave the things they wondered at substantial being after their own ideas, just as children do, whom we see take inanimate things in their hands and play with them, and talk to them as though they were living persons, as laid down in an axiom. 376. In such fashion, the first men of the Gentile nations, children of nascent mankind as we have styled them in the axioms, created things according to their own ideas. But this creation was infinitely different from that of God. For God, in his purest intelligence, knows things, and by knowing them creates them. But they, in their robust ignorance, did it by virtue of a wholly corporeal imagination. And because it was quite corporeal, they did it with marvelous sublimity. A sublimity such and so great that it excessively perturbed the very persons who by feigning did the creating, for which they were called poets, which is Greek for makers. Now this is the threshold labor of great poetry. 1. To invent sublime fables suited to the popular understanding. 2. To perturb the excess with a view to the end proposed. 3. To teach the vulgar to act virtuously, as the poets have taught themselves, as will presently be shown. Of this nature of human things there came an eternal property, expressed in a noble phrase of Tacitus, that frightened men vainly, quote, no sooner feign than they believe, end quote. 377. Of such natures must have been the first founders of Gentile humanity, when at last the sky fearfully rolled with thunder, and flashed with lightning, as could not but follow from the bursting upon the air for the first time of an impression so violent. As we have postulated, this occurred 100 years after the flood in Mesopotamia, and 200 after it throughout the rest of the world. For it took that much time to reduce the earth to such a state that, dry of the moisture of the universal flood, it could send up dry exhalations, or matter igniting in the air to produce lightning. Thereupon a few giants, who must have been the most robust, and who were dispersed through the forest on the mountain heights, were the strongest beasts. Their dens were frightened and astonished by the great effect, whose cause they did not know, and raised their eyes and became aware of the sky. And because in such a case, as stated in the axioms, the nature of the human mind leads it to attribute to its own nature to the effect, and because in that state their nature was that of men all robust bodily strength, who express their very violent passions by shouting and grumbling, they picture the sky to themselves as a great animated body, which in that aspect they called Jove, the first god of the so-called gentes majores, by whom the whistling of his bolts and the noise of his thunder was attempting to tell them something. And thus they began to exercise that natural curiosity which is the daughter of ignorance and the mother of knowledge, and which, opening the mind of man, gives birth to wonder, as we have put it above in the axioms. This characteristic still persists in the vulgar, who, when they see a comet or a sundog or some other extraordinary thing in nature, and in particular in the countenance of the sky, at once turn curious and anxiously inquire what it means, as we have seen it in Axiom 189. When they wonder at the prodigious effects of the magnet on iron, even in this age of minds enlightened and made erudite by philosophy, they come out with this, that the magnet has an occult sympathy for the iron, and that they make of all nature a vast animate body which feels passions and effects, as we have noted in the axioms. 378. That the nature of our civilized minds is so detached from the senses, even in the vulgar, by abstractions corresponding to all the abstract terms our languages abound in, and so refined by the art of writing, and as it were spiritualized by the use of numbers, because even the vulgar know how to count and reckon, that it is naturally beyond our power to form the vast image of this mistress called sympathetic nature. Men shape the phrase with their lips, but have nothing in their minds, for what they have in mind is falsehood, which is nothing, and their imagination no longer avails to form a vast false image. It is equally beyond our power to enter into the vast imagination of those first men, whose minds were not in the least abstract, refined, or spiritualized, because they were entirely immersed in the senses, buffeted by the passions, buried in the body. That is why we said above that we can scarcely understand, still less imagine, how those first men thought who founded Gentile humanity. 379. In this fashion, the first theological poets created the first divine fable, the greatest they ever created, that of Jove, king and father of men and gods, in the act of hurling the lightning bolt, an image so popular, disturbing, and instructive that its creators themselves believed in it, and feared, revered, and worshipped it in frightful religions, which we shall shortly describe. And by that trait of the human mind we found noticed by Tacitus in the Axioms, these men attributed to Jove all they saw, imagined, or even did themselves. And to all of the universe that came within their scope, to all its parts, they assigned the being of an animate substance. This is the civil history of the expression, all things are full of Jove, or gods, by which Plato understood the ether which penetrates and fills the universe. But for the theological poets, as will shortly be seen, Jove was no higher than the mountain peaks. The first men who spoke by signs naturally believed that lightning bolts and thunderclaps were signs made to them by Jove, whence from nuo, to make a sign, came numen, the divine will, by an idea more than sublime and worthy to express the divine majesty. They believed that Jove commanded by signs, that such signs were real words, and that nature was the language of Jove. The science of this language the Gentiles universally believed to be divination, which by the Greeks was called theology, meaning the science of the language of gods. Thus Jove acquired the fearful kingdom of the lightning and became the king of men and gods, and he acquired the two titles, that of Bes, Optimus, in the sense of strongest, Fortissimus, as by a reverse process, fortis meant in early Latin what bonus did in late, and that of greatest, Maximus, from his vast body, the sky itself. For the first great mercy he showed mankind by not destroying it with his bolts. He received the title Soter, or Savior. This is the first of the three principles we have taken for our science. And for having put an end to the feral wandering of these few giants, so that they became the princes of the gentes, he received the epithet stator, stayer or establisher. The Latin philologians explain this epithet too narrowly from Jove, invoked by Romulus, having stopped the Romans in their flight from the battle with the Sabines. 380. Thus the many Joves the philologians wonder at are so many physical histories, preserved for us by the fables, which prove the universality of the flood, as we premised in the Axioms. For every Gentile nation had its Jove, and the Egyptians had the conceit to say that their Jove, Ammon, was the most ancient of them all, as was said above in the Axioms. 381. Thus, in accordance with what has been said in the Axioms about the principles of the poetic characters, Jove was born naturally in poetry as a divine character, or imaginative universal, to which everything having to do with the auspices was referred by all the ancient Gentile nations, which must therefore have been poetic by nature. Their poetic wisdom began with this poetic metaphysics, which contemplated God by the attribute of his providence. And they were called theological poets, or sages, who understood the language of the gods expressed in the auspices of Jove, and were properly called divine in the sense of diviners, from divinari, to divine or predict. Their science was called muse, defined above by Homer as the knowledge of good and evil, that is, divination on the prohibition of which God ordained his true religion for Adam, as was said in the Axioms. Because they were versed in this mystic theology, the Greek poets, who explained the divine mysteries of the auspices and oracles, were called mystae, which Horace learnedly translates interpreters of the gods. Every Gentile nation had its own sibyl versed in this science, and we find mention of 12 of them. Sibyls and oracles are the most ancient things of the Gentile world. 382. All the things here discussed agree with that golden passage of Eusebius, i.e. Lactantius, referred to in the Axioms, where he speaks of the origins of idolatry, that the first people, simple and rough, invented the gods from terror of present power. Thus it was fear which created gods in the world. But as we remarked in the Axioms, not fear awakened in men by other men, but fear awakened in men by themselves. Along with this origin of idolatry is demonstrated likewise the origin of divination, which was brought into the world at the same birth. The origins of these two were followed by that of the sacrifices made to procure or rightly understand the auspices. 383. That such was the origin of poetry is finally confirmed by this eternal property of it, that its proper material is the credible impossibility. It is impossible that bodies should be minds, yet it was believed that the thundering sky was Jove, and nothing is dearer to poets than singing the marvels wrought by sorceresses by means of incantations. All this is to be explained by a hidden sense the nations have of the omnipotence of God. From this sense springs another by which all peoples are naturally led to do infinite honors to divinity. In this manner the poets founded religions among the Gentiles. 384. All that has been so far said here upsets all the theories of the origin of poetry from Plato and Aristotle down to Patrizzi, Scaliger, and Castelvetro. For it has been shown that it was deficiency of human reasoning power that gave rise to poetry so sublime that the philosophies which came afterwards, the arts of poetry and of criticism, have produced none equal or better, and have even prevented its production. Hence it is Homer's privilege to be, of all the sublime, that is, the heroic poets, the first in the order of merit as well as in that of age. This discovery of the origins of poetry does away with the opinion of the matchless wisdom of the ancients, so ardently sought after from Plato to Bacon's About Wisdom. For the wisdom of the ancients was the vulgar wisdom of the lawgivers who founded the human race, not the esoteric wisdom of great and rare philosophers. Whence it will be found, as it has been in the case of Jove, that all the mystic meanings of lofty philosophy attributed by the learned to the Greek fables and the Egyptian hieroglyphics are as impertinent as the historical meanings they both must have had are natural. Chapter 2. Corollaries concerning the principal aspects of this science. 385. 1. From what has been said up to this point, it is concluded that divine providence, apprehended by such human sense as could have been possessed by rough, wild, and savage men, who in despair of nature's succors desired something superior to nature to save them, which is the first principle on which we establish the method of this science, permitted them to be deceived into fearing the false divinity of Jove, because he could strike them with lightning. Thus, through the thick clouds of those first tempests, intermittently lit by those flashes, they made out this great truth, that divine providence watches over the welfare of all mankind, so that this science becomes, in this principal aspect, a rational civil theology of divine providence, which began in the vulgar wisdom of the lawgivers, who founded the nations by contemplating God under the attribute of providence, and which is completed by the esoteric wisdom of the philosophers, who give a rational demonstration of it in their natural theology. 2. 386. Here begins also a philosophy of authority, a second principal aspect of this science, taking the word authority in its original meaning of property. The word is always used in this sense in the law of the 12 tables, and the term auctores was accordingly applied to those from whom we derive title to property. Auctor certainly comes from autos, proprius or suis ipsius. Many scholars write autor or autorius, leaving out the aspirate. 385. Authority was at first divine, the authority by which divinity appropriated to itself the few giants we have spoken of, by properly casting them into the depths and recesses of the caves under the mountains. This is the iron ring by which the giants dispersed upon the mountains were kept chained to the earth by fear of the sky and of Jove, wherever they happened to be when the sky first thundered. Such were Titius and Prometheus, chained to a high rock, with their hearts being devoured by an eagle, that is, by the religion of Jove's auspices. Their being rendered immobile by fear was expressed by the Latins in the heroic phrase terrora defixi, and the artists depict them chained hand and foot with such links upon the mountains. Of these links was formed the great chain which Dionysius Longinus admires as the highest sublimity in all the Homeric fables. Concerning this chain, Jove, to which that he is king of men and gods, asserts that if all the gods and men were to take hold of one end, he alone at the other end would be able to drag them all. The Stoics would have the chains represent the eternal series of causes, by which their fate holds the world, girdled and bound, but let them look out lest they be entangled in it themselves, because the dragging of men and gods by this chain depends on the will of Jove, yet they would have Jove subject to fate. 388. Upon this divine authority followed human authority in the full philosophic sense of the term, that is, the property of human nature, which not even God can take from man without destroying him. It is in this sense that Terence speaks of the pleasures proper to the gods, meaning that the felicity of God does not depend on others. And Horace, of the laurels proper to virtue, meaning that the triumph of virtue cannot be taken away by envy. And Caesar, of their own victory, which Denis Pateau erroneously considers bad Latin, whereas it is exceedingly elegant Latin for a victory which could not be snatched from his hands by the enemy. This authority is the free use of the will, the intellect, on the other hand, being a passive power subject to truth. For from this first point of all human things, men began to exercise the freedom of the human will to hold in check the motions of the body, either to subdue them entirely or to give them better direction, this being the impulse proper to the free agents, as we have said above in the method. Hence it was that the giants gave up the bestial custom of wandering through the great forest of the earth, and habituated themselves to the quite contrary custom of remaining settled and hidden for a long period in their caves. 389. This authority of human nature was followed by the authority of natural law. For having occupied and remained settled for a long time in the places where they chanced to find themselves at the time of the first thunderbolts, they became lords of them by occupation and long possession, the source of all dominion in the world. These are those, quote, few whom just Jupiter loved, end quote, from whom the philosophers later metamorphosed into men favored by God with natural aptitudes for science and virtue. But the historical significance of this phrase is that in the recesses and depths of the caves, they became the princes of the so-called gentes majoris, who counted Jove the first god, as noted in the axioms. As will be shown later, these were the ancient noble houses, branching out into many families, of which the first kingdoms and the first cities were composed. Their memory was preserved in those fine heroic Latin phrases: Condere gentes, condere regna, condere urbis, fundere gentes, fundere regna, fundere urbis. 390. This philosophy of authority follows the rational civil theology of providence, because by means of the former's theological proofs, the latter, with its philosophical ones, makes clear and distinct the philological ones, all three kinds of proofs being enumerated in this method. And with a reference to the things of the most obscure antiquity of the nations, it reduces to certitude the human will, which is by its nature most uncertain, as noted in the axioms, which is as much as to say that it reduces philology to the form of a science. 391. The third principal aspect is a history of human ideas. These, as we have just seen, began with divine ideas by way of contemplation of the heavens with the bodily eyes. Thus, in their science of augury, the Romans used the verb contemplari, for observing the parts of the sky whence the auguries came or auspices were taken. These regions marked out by the augurs with their wands were called temples of the sky, whence must have come to the Greeks their first theoremata or mathemata, things divine or sublime to contemplate, which eventuated in metaphysical and mathematical abstractions. This is the civil history of the saying, "From Jove the muse began." For we have just seen that Jove's bolts produced the first muse, which Homer defines as knowledge of good and evil. At this point it was all too easy for the philosophers later to intrude the dictum that the beginning of wisdom is piety. The first muse must have been Urania, who contemplated the heavens to take the auguries. Later she came to stand for astronomy, as will presently be shown. Just as poetic metaphysics was above divided into all its subordinate sciences, each sharing the poetic nature of their mother, so this history of ideas will present the rough origins of both the practical sciences in use among the nations and of the speculative sciences which, now refined, are celebrated by the learned. 4. 392. The fourth aspect is a philosophical criticism which grows out of the aforesaid history of ideas. Such a criticism will render true judgment upon the founders of the nations, which must have taken well over 1,000 years to produce the writers who are the subjects of philological criticism. Beginning with Jove, our philosophical criticism will give us a natural theogony, or generation of the gods, as it took form naturally in the minds of the founders of the Gentile world, who were by nature theological poets. The 12 gods of the so-called Gentis Maioris, the ideas of whom were imagined by them from time to time on certain occasions of human necessity or utility, are assigned to 12 short epochs, into which we divide the period in which the fables were born. Thus, this natural theogony will give us a rational chronology of poetic history for at least 900 years before vulgar history, which came after the heroic period had its first beginnings. 5. 393. The fifth aspect is an ideal eternal history traversed in time by the histories of all nations. Wherever, emerging from savage, fierce, and bestial times, men begin to domesticate themselves by religion, they begin, proceed, and end by those stages which are investigated in the second book, to be encountered again in the fourth book, where we treat the course the nations run, and in the fifth, where we treat the recurrence of human things. 6. 394. The sixth is a system of the natural law of nations. The three princes of this doctrine, Hugo Grotius, John Selden, and Samuel Pufendorf, should have taken their start, by one of the axioms above laid down, from the beginnings of the nations where their subject matters begin. But all three of them err together in this respect, by beginning in the middle, that is, with the latest times of the civilized nations, and thus of men enlightened by fully developed natural reason, from which the philosophers emerged and rose to meditation of a perfect idea of justice. 395. First, Grotius, just because of the great love he bears the truth, sets aside the divine providence and professes that his system will stand even if all knowledge of God be left out of account. Thus, all the reproofs which in a great number of matters he brings against the Roman jurists do not touch them at all, since they took divine providence for their first principle, and proposed to treat of the natural law of nations, not that of the philosophers and moral theologians. 396. Then Selden assumes providence, but without paying any attention to the inhospitableness of the first peoples, or to the division of people of God made of the whole world of nations at that time into the Hebrews and Gentiles, or to the fact that, since the Hebrews had lost sight of their natural law during their slavery in Egypt, God himself must have re-established it for them by the law he gave Moses on Sinai, or to the further fact that God in his law forbids even thoughts that are less than just, with which no mortal lawgiver has ever troubled himself, or to the bestial origins here discussed of all the Gentile nations. And although he pretends that the Jews presently taught their natural law to the Gentiles, he is entirely unable to prove it, opposed as he is by the magnanimous confession of Josephus, seconded by the grave reflection of Lactantius cited above, and by the hostility with which, as we have also observed above, the Jews have always regarded the Gentiles, and which they preserve even now when dispersed among the nations. 397. And finally, Pufendorf begins with an Epicurean hypothesis, supposing men to have been cast into this world without any help or care from God. Reproved for this, he defends himself in special dissertation, but because he does not admit providence as his first principle, he cannot even begin to speak of law, as we have heard Cicero tell Atticus the Epicurean in his dialogue De Legibus. 398. For all these reasons, we begin our treatment of law, the Latin for which is ius, contraction of the ancient us, at this most ancient point of all times, at the moment when the idea of Jove was born in the minds of the founders of the nations. From the Latin derivation of ius from us, there is a striking parallel in Greek. For, as by a happy chance we find Plato observing in the Cratylus, the Greeks called at first daion. This means pervasive or enduring by a philosophical etymology intruded by Plato himself, whose erudite mythology makes Jove the ether which penetrates and flows through all things. But the historical derivation of daion is from Jove, from the Greeks called dios, whence the Latin expression sub dio, which equally with sub iov means under the open sky. For the sake of euphony, daion came later to be pronounced dikeon. This is then our point of departure for the discussion of law, which was originally divine in the proper sense expressed by divination, the science of Jove's auspices, which were the divine things by which the nations regulated all human things. These two classes of things taken together make up the adequate subject matter of jurisprudence. Thus our treatment of natural law begins with the idea of divine providence, and the same birth with which was born the idea of law. For law began naturally to be observed, in the manner examined above, by the founders of the gentes, properly so called, those of the most ancient order, which were called gentes maioris, whose first god was Jove. 7. 399. The seventh and last of the principal aspects of this science is that of the principles of universal history. It begins with the first moment of all human things of the Gentile world, with the first of the 3 ages of the world, which the Egyptians said had elapsed before them, namely, the age of the gods, in which heaven began to reign on earth, and to bestow great benefits on men, as noted in the axioms. This is the golden age of the Greeks, in which the gods consorted with men on earth, as we have seen Jove begin to do. Starting with this first age of the world, the Greek poets in their fables have faithfully narrated the universal flood and the existence of giants in nature, and thus have truly narrated the beginnings of profane universal history. Yet this history has hitherto lacked beginning for the following reasons. Later men were unable to enter into the imaginations of the first men who founded the Gentile world, which made them think they saw the gods. The verb atterrere was no longer understood in its proper sense, to send underground. The giants who lived hidden in the caves under the mountains were metamorphosed in the later traditions of over-credulous peoples, and were supposed to have piled Olympus, Pelion, and Ossa one on top of the other to drive the gods from heaven. Actually, the first impious giants not only did not fight the gods, but were not even aware of them until Jove hurled his bolts. And whereas heaven was raised to an enormous height by the much more developed minds of later Greeks, to the first giants it was but the mountain summits, as we shall presently show. The fable mentioned above, of the giant storming heaven, must have been invented after Homer, and fastened on him by interpolation in the Odyssey. For in his time, merely to shake Olympus would have sufficed to dislodge the gods, since in the Iliad he always represents them as residing on the summit of Mount Olympus. For all these reasons, profane universal history has hitherto lacked its beginning, and for lack of the rational chronology of poetic history, it has lacked its continuity as well. This is the end of the Prolegomena and first section of Book 2 of The New Science by Giambattista Vico. In the next video, we will proceed to Section 2, entitled Poetic Logic. Thank you for listening.